given all that he said in terms of isolationism during the campaign. I do not think the loss, the unfortunate, really unfortunate loss of this child is enough to start that kind of military effort.
So anyway, Jeannie, what do? You wait till a missile's on its way to Los Angeles and hope, as Ebony points out, that missile interceptor works, and if it doesn't, you sacrifice Los Angeles to say, you know what, we waited, we shouldn't have waited. Or do you go ahead and say, there is going to be, by the way, if you do this with what I just suggested, if you do a preemptive strike to wipe out their missile, or their nuclear program, or at least put it back several decades, you will have a lot of innocent people who will die. The casualties of war will be massive. Thousands, tens of thousands will die.
You're not talking about the abstract. Eric, are you advocating right now, if you were in charge, you'd say, let's go, let's wipe them out?
Here's what I've said in the past. I said this Kim Jong-un continues to test these missiles that put more and more danger to our West Coast.
I'm with you.
I think
solution?
I think the next time we test another missile,
I'm always going to be against. I'm always going to be very wary of killing innocent civilians. Large.
Well, he's on the table and he's gone to code, and I do not think anyone knows what they're doing here. And your friends are left you, you've been dismissed. I never thought it would come to this, and I
on North Korea, the sanctions, if they don't work, are all options still on the table? Can I get your answer and also the Prime Minister's thoughts?
Well, to the second, we'll have to see. I don't think I would exactly play that card, but we'll have to see. If the sanctions don't work, we'll have to go phase two. Phase two may be a very rough thing, may be very, very unfortunate for the world, but hopefully the sanctions will work. We have tremendous support all around the world for what we're doing. It really is a rogue nation. If we can make a deal, it'll be a great thing. And if we can't, something will have to happen.
What surprised you today about Kim Jong-un?
Really, he's got a great personality. He's a, funny guy. He's a very smart guy. He's a great negotiator. He loves his people, not that I'm surprised by that, but he loves his people, and I think that we have the start of an amazing deal. We're going to de-nuke North Korea. It's going to start immediately, and a lot of other things are happening. He'll do it. I really believe that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. I really believe, and it was really the engine testing site, in addition to all of the other things that they've agreed to do. They have a very powerful engine testing site that, again, we're able to see because of the heat that it emits. And I'm able to, I'm very happy. I'll tell you what, I'm very happy with those 2 points, the 2 points you mentioned, but I think you might be referring to the thing that's not in, which is the engine testing site. Honestly, I think he's going to do these things. I may be wrong. I mean, I may stand before you in 6 months and say, hey, I was wrong. I don't know that I'll ever admit that, but I'll find some kind of an excuse. Okay, one more. Come on.
I'm very, very honored for this award, the MPAC Voices of Courage and Conscience Media Award. There was, however, very little courage, and one would hope an ordinary amount of conscience at work in producing our Israel-Palestine episode of Parts Unknown. I was enormously grateful for the response from Palestinians in particular for doing what seemed to me an ordinary thing, something we do all the time, show regular people doing everyday things, cooking and enjoying meals, playing with their children, talking about their lives, their hopes and dreams. It is a measure, I guess, of how twisted and shallow our depiction of a people is, that these images come as a shock to so many. The world has visited many terrible things on the Palestinian people, none more shameful than robbing them of their basic humanity. People are not statistics. That is all we attempted to show. A small, pathetically small step towards understanding. To be recognized in this way means a lot to me and to all of us who worked on the show. And for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thanks.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I'm Michael Brooks. We're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else. Greetings, comrades, friends, and enemies, with super producer Matt. Wait for it. Leck.
Hello, everybody.
Head theoretician David Griscom.
How's it going?
It's going well. How did I do?
Not bad at all.
Sweet. Super producer David Slavic is roaming the digitosphere, the Discord, Twitter, everywhere else, in the ever-expanding, ever-aggressive TMBS universe. In this week's program, Mike Hanna. He's an independent journalist, news presenter. He covers Washington, D.C. and the United Nations for Al Jazeera. He's the former CNN Jerusalem bureau chief, and we are talking about the Trump and Un show, plus the United Nations and the crisis, the abuse, systemic oppression of Gaza, and where does Iran stand now, weeks after Trump detonated that deal. And then Cody Johnston, he is the host of Some More News. He joins me, and we are taking on the cult of Elon Musk. Yep, I did it, incels. Sorry. Went right at your hero. Cody and I are talking about that, the why of it, and much, much more. Plus, we have a very important shout out, which will really anchor the reality of what has been behind some of these small steps of progress in the Korean Peninsula. Plus, a major global terrorist that chances are you've never heard of died yesterday rather. He's going to be sentenced to the gulag for eternity. And we have a Griscom Economic Minute. It's the hot news segment. Thank you, DJ Danarchy. Thank you, everybody. Let's go. And let's start with an assessment of this meeting between Trump and the president and the chairman. There's been a really bizarre media ecosystem around this meeting. There's just the innate bizarreness of Trump and Kim Jong-un as leaders. There's the sort of profound bizarreness of the 4-minute propaganda video that Trump aides showed to press people in Singapore. And there is the reality that the results so far have been largely symbolic, but symbols really, really matter. And there is a certain derangement syndrome in opposing this meeting among some of the more sort of resistance parts of the contingent that I want to highlight, along with how this looks in relation to Iran and how this fits into a broader overall Asia strategy that still remains highly militarized. But let's start by going back to, and here we are, we have some B-roll of the handshakes between the president and the chairman. But let's go now back to July 3rd, 2007. This is a Democratic Party debate. And then Senator Barack Obama got this question and provided an answer that should still be the blueprint for all U.S. diplomacy.
In 1982, Anwar Sadat traveled to Israel, a trip that resulted in a peace agreement that has lasted ever since. In the spirit of that type of bold leadership, would you be willing to meet separately, without precondition, during the first year of your administration in Washington or anywhere else, with the leaders of Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea, in order to bridge the gap that divides our countries?
Should also point out that Stephen is in the crowd tonight. Senator Obama?
I would. And the reason is this, that the notion that somehow not talking to countries is punishment to them, which has been the guiding diplomatic principle of this administration, is ridiculous. Now, Ronald Reagan and Democratic presidents like JFK constantly spoke to Soviet Union at a time when Ronald Reagan called them an evil empire. And the reason is because they understood that we may not trust them, they may pose an extraordinary danger to this country, but we have the obligation to find areas where we can potentially move forward. And I think that it is a disgrace that we have not spoken to them. We've been talking about Iraq. One of the first things that I would do in terms of moving a diplomatic effort in the region forward is to send a signal that we need to talk to Iran and Syria, because they're going to have responsibilities if Iraq collapses.
Okay, so he was absolutely right. He remains absolutely right. Let's be clear about this. Yes, the results of this meeting were symbolic. There was aspirations about denuclearization. That's not happening anytime soon. There was military exercises, war games that Trump called off, clearly without coordination with South Korea and without coordination with his own military. That remains to be seen. I think calling a lot of those exercises off is a good thing. So even what he has impulsively given up is a positive signal. Now, just to give a little bit of context here, there's a history that I spoke about several episodes ago on the sort of history of policy failures and attempts at diplomacy with North Korea. There was the agreed framework in the Clinton administration, which was bogged with problems from the beginning. There was a reckless pullout by the Bush administration. Then there was an attempt to reach a similar sort of deal in 2005. Obama practiced strategic patience with regards to North Korea, and not actually the commitment that he made in this debate answer. And now we have clearly, again, a reckless president, one who doesn't do strategy, one who has no coherence of worldview. But with regards to this situation, the sort of liberal hysteria about leverage is a myth that we'll get to in a second. But let's get a little bit more broadly into the history here. Now, the North Korean regime is absolutely one really arguably unparalleled in terms of humanitarian abuses. Everything from ordering killings in his own family to systems of gulags, political monitoring, sexual violence, everything imaginable this regime does. That's not debatable. There's also the reality that over 1 million civilians, over 3 million civilians were killed in the Korean War, with the majority of them in the north. I had seen war-battered cities in Europe, the Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas confessed, but I have not seen the devastation I had until I had seen Korea. One of the most brutal episodes was the No-Gun Ri massacre, in which the United States troops machine guns hundreds of Korean civilians who had huddled under a bridge for safety. The United States absolutely was complicit in horrific crimes towards North Korea, and from a North Korean perspective, has maintained a circle of U.S. troop presence inside South Korea, war games surrounding it, and issued its own threats and condemnations of it as a regime. So that's not an excuse. That's just a full understanding of the reality. Now, some Democrats and some sort of mainstream commentators seem to go in reverse gear from freak out that Trump was going to start a global war with North Korea, which is a legitimate concern given the state of mind and competence of this administration, to a reverse ultra hawkery and performativity about the imagery of meeting with Kim, and the the idea that because the North Koreans want this level of recognition and prestige, that this is a sort of unbelievably important U.S. bargaining chip that Trump was giving up. And it is true. This is something that the North Koreans have always wanted. They've wanted it for decades, and they haven't gotten it. They didn't have it with Clinton. They didn't have it with Bush. They obviously didn't have it with Obama. Now, what has that posture achieved? Nothing. That posture has achieved more isolation, more sort of wars of words. None of these previous diplomatic agreements, including the more ambitious agreed framework, have sustained. And North Korea has nuclear weapons. So this is a fear about a ship that has already sailed. Any person who is right-minded knows that the reality is that war with North Korea, unless you're a lunatic, a demented person like Lindsey Graham, who's mused on this and said, better they die than we die, that military conflict with North Korea is impossible right now. It is an impossibility. Anybody who would advocate for that is advocating for mass unnecessary death, period, including the destruction of one of our most important allies, even from that very basic strategic perspective, not to mention the mass humanitarian consequences. There will be no war unless people who really believe in God get into power, okay? Or maybe there will be war because our policy in Asia is essentially a subsidiary of the arms manufacturing industry, which is a deeper structural problem over the next couple of decades, particularly as we deal with issues like the Taiwan Straits with China. But with regards to North Korea, we can't have war with them. That means that the best scenarios we can have is an open line of communication between leadership so that, as an example, a mistake doesn't happen. A satellite isn't misinterpreted to be a weapon, as an example. That people can, this is actually one of the biggest concerns of Korea experts, was that a conflict could break out purely based to non-traditional, to lines of communication not being properly established, which was a major concern at the beginning of this administration. Now there is a line of communication between the two dictators. That's a positive step forward. And also, I would suggest that for all of the rightful cynicism and concern and fear about anything this administration is involved in, some of the rhetoric coming out of this meeting and the reality of the meeting validates the peace movement in South Korea, which we'll be talking about in the Shoutout. An opinion whose I would weigh sort of much more highly than the average overcompensated NBC hawk. This looks ridiculous in relation to Iran. Iran made real sacrifices. They did a real deal, and they were portrayed. There's no doubt that the United States and Trump looks absolutely ludicrous in the global system. And the lesson for any state is to acquire weapons and get that deterrence. That's a bigger structural problem. But the reality of what North Korea and the United States face is that negotiation and talks are literally the only thing possible. And this, as ridiculous as it was a step in the direction, in a positive direction, that everybody should recognize. Now, we will get actually relatively quickly to the shout out because we want to talk about a really special group.
And we're back.
Yes, well, this is important.
I don't want to get greedy, but if Danarchy could give us a shout out beat, that would be ill. Top of the line professionalism. Let's get to the shout out. Shout out, shout out. Creepy. Shout out, shout out, shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is crazy. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is out of control. Shout out, shout out. That's creepy. Shout out, shout out. That's weird. Shout out, creepy. Shout out, weird. Shout out, crazy. Shout out, shout out. This is crazy. Shout out. This is out of control. Shout out. This is weird. Shout out, 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 shout out.
Were you feeling that as much as it looked like, Griscom? You were really into that, man.
Dude, I love that Alex Jones voice.
Alex Jones, dude. Alex Jones spits. It's just, it's not debatable. He's the finest broadcaster of our generation. There is a group, I believe it is called Women Crossing the DMZ. The DMZ is the demilitarized zone.
Not the Dennis Miller thing.
It's definitely not the Dennis Miller thing, and I bet many women would prefer to cross the DMZ than cross the DMZ. But it's a nonviolent civil society organization based in South Korea that advocates for peace and reconciliation between both sides of the conflict. And they do this in a variety of ways, including lobbying, media appearances, and sort of trying to shape a broader narrative about this conflict. They're certainly influential to some extent in the current South Korean government, which has adopted a significantly more conciliatory and diplomatic tone, and they definitely should be praised and acknowledged every step of the way, Moon Jae-in and the current South Korean government. I'm going to read now. This is first from Brookings. On May, but this also involves civil society protests in one of the most tense pieces of physical space in the on the planet, the demilitarized zone between South and North Korea. On May 24th, 2015, 30 women from 15 countries traversed north to south over 38th parallel that has divided the Korean peninsula for almost 70 years. Although critics condemn these women as naive dupes of the Pyongyang regime, e.g. South Korean protesters harangue them with insults such as useful idiots, which is typical right-wing sort of stuff, and deceive the world, you are unqualified for peace. What these women did, and we'll quote, I'm going to continue quoting now from this is now from their own site, in their own words. On May 2015, on the 70th anniversary of Korea's division into two separate states by the Cold War powers, 30 international women peacemakers from around the world walked with thousands of Korean women north and south to call an end to the Korean War, reunification of families, and women's leadership in the peace process. We held international peace symposiums in Pyongyang and Seoul where we listened to Korean women and shared our experiences and ideas of mobilizing women to bring an end to war and violent conflict. On May 24th, International Women's Day for Peace and Disarmament, we successfully crossed the 2-mile-wide demilitarized zone that separates millions of Korean families as a symbolic act of peace. That energy is part of the context that allows for the symbology of what we saw in Singapore, and symbology is actually very important in international affairs. So all props to them, to the women crossing the DMZ. They are the Shoutout. And let's talk about why it's time, if you haven't yet, and a lot of you have, to become a patron of TMBS. We continue to grow steadily, so as always, we thank all of you. I want to thank everybody on the team and all the patrons who are making this possible. Woke Bros is the new show exclusively for patrons that I co-host with Waz, who's of course crew on this show. We give you this show. A lot of work goes into a 2-hour public show that we do every week, and the vision really to kind of have almost like a late night show of YouTube that sort of covers everything from the sacred to the profane, from the crass to the most evolved. We want to hit it all, and of course including those animations. Then the post game, which when we announce our new YouTube channel, which I think is going to be next week, we're going to unlock a couple of those, as well as starting to chop these up into smaller bits of content so you can keep sort of spreading the message, the content across all of your social networks.
Dissemination.
Dissemination. It's a big, I mean, you see disseminating, there's a lot of heat around it. And the Illicit History series continues. This past Sunday, Mark Blythe stopped by, official friend of show now, to talk about the Eurozone. This Sunday, on a follow-up, we're actually talking with a Eurozone policymaker on what a reworked Eurozone based on a workers' movement would actually look like. If you go into the archives, there's everything from histories of Silicon Valley fascism to Jamaican politics to theory primers on the ABCs of Marxism, CLR James, the Russian Revolution. It's a full political education, plus a community on Discord, plus if you go comment or above, phone calls with me. We have a lot of momentum. It's real, It's focused on winning. It's socialist. It's unapologetic. It's global. The patron count from every corner of the earth is very, very satisfying and meaning, particularly to me, my sort of outlook on things. So patreon.com/TMBS, patreon.com/TMBS. It's time. And keep spreading the word. You can follow us all on Twitter, @_Michael Brooks, @TMBS FM, @NatLech. You got
correct.
that?
MATTLECH.
And what do you got, David? You have @David?
@David Griscom.
Perfect. @David Griscom. Find us, spread the word, join. It's time. We'll be right back with Mike Hanna. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Mike Hanna. He's an independent journalist and news presenter. He covers the United Nations and Washington, D.C. for Al Jazeera, and he's the former CNN Jerusalem bureau chief and, of course, the foreign policy czar of the Michael Brooks Show. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Michael.
I would like to start, Mike, with your thoughts on this meeting that took place between the U.S. leader, Trump, North Korean leader, Un. You know, I'll just set it really briefly by saying that my basic stance on this is that it is certainly better that these two countries be in communication, given the context. I think that's certainly preferable to a sort of war of words and threats. The meeting may have been almost entirely symbolic, but symbols are powerful. What's your take?
Yes, I think that's precisely correct. It's far better, regardless of the context in which these leaders are talking to each other, rather than the kind of massive threats and on the brink of war that we had for so many months in the course of the beginning of the Trump administration. All of that being said, though, the possibility or the danger is that everything's being set up for a fall. This meeting went ahead, symbolic, as you say it was. There are policy teams working behind this. There will be ongoing negotiations, obviously. Substantive negotiations have already taken place before this meeting happened. We know that between senior negotiators from the U.S., senior negotiators from North Korea, whom incidentally have negotiated on a number of occasions before in past years during the Six Powers talks, for example. But the danger is that this is being set up for a fall. And there's one simple fact that underlines all of this. This is, I think, the 8th such agreement or commitment signed by North Korea concerning denuclearization. They have all fallen apart for some reason or other, normally because of North Korea non-compliance. I think that we've got to temper the delight is too strong a word, but the approval of this meeting with the knowledge of what has happened in the past and the difficulty of the negotiations to come.
Do you see a paradox in that, though, between the fact that, yes, these previous things, like the agreed framework that I was talking about earlier during the Clinton administration, yes, they fell apart, and I agree with you. It does seem to be, I mean, the United States had its own problems, and certainly the Bush administration, I think, particularly upon coming into office, was very reckless about not only the agreed framework, but also undermining a more sort of dovish South Korean government at that time. But that being said, what strikes me, and I could be wrong about this, but it's sort of the paradox is that on one hand, yes, these agreements have collapsed in the past. Those agreements in the past have been much more narrow and specific. This agreement, or non-agreement so far, I mean, what was actually signed was both, you know, nothing really in terms of specifics. Actually, I think the highest specifics that they just signed in Singapore was helping retrieve, POWs' remains. And then on the other hand, much more sort of aspirational in terms of, these, goals that are obviously laudable and we would all want, but much more in the future, denuclearizing the peninsula. This was not something that the Clinton administration was talking with the North Koreans about. So there's something in that paradox.
Well, yes, it is, Michael, but let me there's a couple of things I must pick up there. Firstly, The last thing you said, that term denuclearization. Now, that has been a term that is actually largely responsible for every single set of talks or every single agreement breaking down.
Yeah.
Because different people mean different things by denuclearization. The U.S. has always kind of said, yep, you denuclearize, you, North Korea. The North Korean position has been total denuclearization.
Right.
When it uses that phrase, it is talking about a denuclearization of all the parties involved in the region, even the United States with regards to that region.
Right.
So it's a far broader perspective, and that is precisely what we have in this agreement today from the North Korean side. But there's another very important point there. There is, in all of this, been one remarkable concession given, and that is by the U.S. For years, China has been arguing substantively that there has to be a freeze-for-freeze scenario. In other words, a disarmament process can begin if the U.S. steps back. So it's a pro quo. Donald Trump has just agreed to a freeze-for-freeze scenario with nothing concrete from the other side. Now, that is a massive shift in U.S. policy, absolutely huge. It was a position that previous U.S. administrations would not budge from. The idea of freeze-for-freeze indicates a kind of equality between the two parties and denies the fact that in all of this, one must remember, there is an extremely dangerous party involved from the U.S. perspective. Now, that particular point had always been used as leverage in negotiations. That has just been thrown away with nothing concrete beginning in return. For a great deal maker, Donald Trump has basically given the price away of the real estate before negotiating a closing deal. So there is something substantive in this, and that is the most substantive thing that has come out of it. And certainly the North Korean negotiators know that, and they know that they are starting off negotiations with already 3 aces showing, looking at a pair of 2s across the table.
Right. I mean, I see that, and I think, I mean, that's just sort of undeniably true. It's I guess it strikes me that a different type of leader than Trump, though, to me, could have made a very similar decision just from the perspective, and this is just sort of my view, that we sort of know, and we'll get to Iran in a moment, and the lessons of this are really clear internationally and not positive, which is that, look, war with North Korea is unthinkable for any rational person who had any humanitarian concern for North Korea, for South Korea, for Japan, I mean, for potentially even a broader regional conflict. So once you sort of recognize that. It seems like, okay, so what do we have to do here, including potentially jettisoning old postures to actually kind of move a process? Now, I agree that Trump, I doubt there's much sort of design behind it, but I hesitate, I guess, from getting overly worried about, this sort of like notion that you're giving away the store, when it seems to me that, we're already kind of past that point. They've already, by acquiring this capacity, made the other alternatives unthinkable. So we need to, figure out, what is this actually going to look like? And potentially maybe it does look like a bit of a less aggressive posture on the peninsula. It seems, to some, certainly the South Koreans don't want us to leave like that at all, but it does seem that the current South Korean leadership is open to at least the sort of reduced temperature, and obviously China is. So it seems to me it's just maybe potentially walking through the only door that's open, and it just does take this kind of, reckless guy who thinks he's a great negotiator to do it, even though he's not actually doing that.
Yes, I think those are all valid points, Michael, but I think that most observers with an interest in a lasting deal that isn't tossed and thrown out in some choleric whim because it's not being done would have been much happier if in some way some kind of verification process was introduced into this broad declaration that we've had now.
Yeah.
There's no mention of rejoining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's no mention of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which throughout the years, throughout the decades, has been the monitor of either disarmament or armament, whatever the case may be. So I just think that it needed that kind of outside force, a force that has been solid throughout the decades, that basically doesn't have a dog in this particular symbolic show. The idea of verification, I think, is central and basic to this process actually working, and would obviate some of the dangers that I mentioned earlier in terms of raising massive hopes, only setting up for a massive fall. And I do think that even at this stage, the idea of verification is absolutely essential, if only to identify what body, what agency is going to be doing the verification.
So that being said, and if we were writing a comedy script now, what would flow exactly out of the point that you just made well would be the sort of call where the North Korean leader phones up the Iranian leadership and is like, you guys are total morons. Like, we just had to say that he builds cool hotels and we got everything we wanted. And you did this whole back channel through Switzerland and had this long convoluted process. Like, what are you guys doing? Because, of course, the Trump administration utterly jettisoned precisely the sort of successful version of the kind of deal you're talking about. Maybe first you could discuss that contrast, and then we'll get into some of the specifics of the fallout of the Iran pullout a couple of weeks in.
I think there's a very basic point here, Michael, and all of that is utterly correct. I mean, the IAEA are the people who are verifying Iranian compliance, which they have continued to do since the Iranian nuclear deal was signed. But there's a difference here, and certainly there's a big difference, it would appear, in the eyes of President Trump himself. Iran did not have weaponized nuclear capacity. North Korea did. The lesson to be learned from this is if you have a viable threat, then you get a lot more than if you don't. So what we are talking about here is a compliance with a commitment not to weaponize. We are talking about a controlled lack of weaponization. Now, that's a very different thing. And I think that the irony, of course, is absolutely remarkable. The deal that President Trump has just torn up and thrown away was a deeply complex deal that had at its basis the idea of verification, that point that I mentioned before. Verification not being done by the United States, being done by the IAEA and by its watchdog bodies, by its inspectors who are on the ground, who visit Iranian sites. So there is a complete, it's absolutely science fiction in a way to look at these two cases and to kind of see within which one is being done and the other isn't. But once again, we get back to the point that you made right at the beginning. It's better that this is happening at this stage than that it's not, regardless of the fact that a deal that took years to actually work out, and a deal that every other party to the treaty agrees was working, to get thrown out on basically a presidential whim.
How is this playing out? You're at the United Nations. I mean, certainly the Europeans have expressed their strong intentions to try to save the deal. Obviously, China and Russia already had different types of relations with Iran. Although there are some reports already indicating, I mean, I think as an example, I think Nike has canceled their contract to outfit the Iranian national soccer team. What does this look like a couple of weeks in terms of the sort of, and as well as Iran sort of playing a delicate diplomacy of actually seeking to preserve the deal while also obviously reserving its own right to step out of it?
Well, look, it's actually complex, not only in terms of the technology of setting up the deal, but actually the legal complexities of it. Put most simply, this is not a bilateral deal between the U.S. and Iran. Legally, in terms of international law, the U.S. cannot simply unilaterally walk away from the deal. There's legal ramifications there, which will play out in the weeks and months and possibly years ahead. The scenario is quite simply is that the U.S. tacked on by what was then a hostile Congress to the then President Obama, tacked on a clause that has nothing to do with the deal that was signed between the parties involved. And that is that Congress has the right to lift the waiver on sanctions should it so be instructed by the president if the president is not satisfied with the process. Now, that has nothing to do with the deal, but that is something that Trump brought up by refusing to sign the waiver on sanctions, throwing it back to Congress. Congress can now reinstitute new sanctions against Iran in defiance of the deal. But this is all totally separate to the international legal foundation of the deal itself, which is a deal signed by all parties and absolutely specifically within the agreement cannot be abrogated by one without agreement of all the others. So, look, you've got a massive legal mess here that it's quite simple for President Trump and the Trump administration to say, don't want this deal anymore, Iranians are being horrible, they are a threat to the region, okay, we're throwing the deal away. Also stating, of course, that nobody's arguing the issue of compliance and verification.
Right.
There is no argument about that. The justification for tearing up the deal relates to other Iranian actions as perceived by the United States, not by their compliance in terms of the nuclear disarmament treaty. So we're in a complete legal morass here, and it's very, very difficult to see how it can emerge without this ongoing unilateral action by the United States, which continues to distance itself from long-time allies and also long-time partners in something like a nuclear deal who may not be allies, but in this particular thing were allies in getting the deal through. So you're looking at a sense of isolationism, which lies at the bottom of all of this, which goes far beyond simply the Iranian nuclear deal. It goes to the standing of the U.S. within the world as a whole. And no doubt the Iranians are saying, too, to the North Koreans, don't sign anything with that administration because really its word just isn't worth anything anymore.
Right. Let's shift. I do want to touch on Gaza a bit before we go. First, we've talked about this before. You were the CNN Jerusalem bureau chief. You also did very powerful, important coverage of Cast Lead in 2008, I believe, or 2009. We've talked about it. We did the illicit history for this program on Ehud Olmert, where we talked extensively about that operation. When you look at what's happened in Gaza over the past several months, and obviously particularly the killings on the day of the Jerusalem embassy opening, first of all, how much does it echo what you already saw and experienced in Gaza? And attached to that, does it strike you that we're really at a point now where there isn't even a sort of basic Israeli interest in kind of a global public perception? That it's just sort of that this is who we are and what we'll do, and that is just so, and we have U.S. backing, and that's it.
Well, I think what you've got to do is see Gaza always, but specifically and particularly in the last year, as more a reflection of Palestinian resistance than a regional resistance to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
You are looking at a scenario where a Palestinian Authority has been crippled both by its own inadequacy and by the controls exerted by Israel. The only sign of real Palestinian resistance that remains is in Gaza. And there's a great awareness of that within Gaza. Hamas has perhaps strategically and perhaps very cleverly seen this, pinpointed the need for some kind of Palestinian resistance to manifest itself to prevent complete capitulation. Right. The kind of capitulation that many would argue has been demonstrated in the West Bank, has been demonstrated by the Palestinian Authority. So the solution to the Gaza crisis is a wider one. It has to do with Palestinian nationalism. It has to do with Palestinian recognition. Without that, it's very, very fertile land for some of those within Hamas who may not be interested in any settlement, who may indeed be set on a course of violence. But it's a violence that is generated by the occupation. So you get back to a scenario where any solution to what is happening in Gaza, humanitarian, political, is a solution that starts with recognizing and dealing with the occupation. It's both that simple and that complex. The Israeli administration, as it stands at present, is not interested in discussing the occupation. The Trump administration is certainly not interested in discussing the occupation. So there you have a scenario where you've got the United States current administration with the agreement and indeed Israel to create a new scenario out of it, and that is Iran. That what is happening in Gaza is a minor sideshow to the greater perceived manipulations of the Iranian power. Right. So you are moving away from dealing with the problem, which is the occupation, to intensifying the problem, which is using a cause which, yes, it may be valid in terms of Iranian support for what is happening in Gaza, but it doesn't deal with the problem. It doesn't approach to begin to find any form of solution whatsoever.
Is there any difference now in terms of, maybe just before we go, could you speak briefly specifically on the Kuwaiti resolution that was before the Security Council that was obviously vetoed by Nikki Haley? It seemed to me, and obviously you know this much better, but it seemed to me that resolution went a bit further than ones in the past, and the sort of general acceptance or at least acquiescence of it outside of the United States was particularly striking.
It was indeed. What is happening in Gaza, particularly at the time that Emergency Security Council was called and that Kuwaiti resolution introduced, had certainly inflamed passions, had made even those who normally sit on the fence jump down solidly behind the terms of the resolution. So yes, circumstances have created an international awareness of a situation that is happening there that is largely attributable to the actions of the Israeli army and the policies of the Israeli government. Now, that was borne out by the fact that in that Security Council vote, the only one against was the United States veto, which meant it didn't go through. So incidentally, that is why the General Assembly session is being held this week to pass a similar resolution by the Kuwaitis, which has no legal standing, of course. It is largely symbolic, but it will be very interesting there to see the votes that are counted in favor of the resolution, which are likely to be overwhelmingly in favor. But just to mention one more thing about that Security Council meeting, Michael, the U.S., as you know, introduced its own resolution, which basically put all the blame on Hamas for all the violence, didn't see Israel as a perpetrator in any way, seeing it as defending its national sovereignty. Now, in an unprecedented move, the only person who voted for that resolution was the ambassador that entered it. So Never before in the United Nations Security Council has there been such a humiliation of a sitting member introducing a resolution, which is what happened on that occasion, which shows you the depth of anger, the depth of international opposition to what is happening in Gaza.
Mike Hanna, he's a presenter, news presenter, journalist. He covers the United Nations as well as Washington global affairs for Al Jazeera. Mike, I always appreciate your time immensely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Lovely to be on the show again.
Okay, talk with you soon. Thank you. All right, folks. It is time for the... Bless you, Matt. It's okay. This is very much a captive environment in here. I've been really taking a much better care of my health. Okay, it's time for the Griscom. Yes? Correct? Griscom. Sorry. Okay, play it again. It's time for a Griscom Economic Minute with our esteemed theoretician, David Griscom.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I've been cursed with the deceptively
I'm sorry.
easy-looking
I actually,
names
it's
to
very
pronounce.
funny. I'm like neurotic about names because I do mess them up, and yours was like it was like a non-linear threat. It was like a black swan threat. I didn't even see it coming.
Yeah, well, turning away from me to everyone else, let's talk about these unemployment numbers. I'm sure at the beginning of of this month, we all noticed our good friend Donald Trump tweeting about this is the greatest economy in the history of America.
Great numbers.
Touting a 3.8% unemployment rate, which is significant. I mean, this is historically low, and there is a lot lower rates of black unemployment, which Trump again cynically highlights. But there's a lot missing from the euphoria and the headlines about the unemployment rate, specifically wage growth. So from 2017 to June 2018, there's only been a 2.7 increase for non-managerial workers, which is barely above inflation. And it is, like, just for context, it's below the average increase in rent prices, which was 3.8% rise last year. So most of the gains that we've seen in the economy continue to go to a certain class, which is not the majority of the people, and it's definitely not the working class. Some additional factors about the unemployment rate that I'd just like to mention before we get into the main segment. One thing that was really interesting about these most recent numbers is the share of older workers, workers in their 60s and above, who are still in the labor market, which basically means a lot of workers don't feel confident enough to be able to retire.
Right.
So why is it so upsetting that there's been such a stagnant growth in wages? It's because the promise of unemployment, the reason we pay attention to this indicator is because a tighter labor market should mean that we have higher wages for workers, because workers should be more confident, because employers are less likely to want to lose workers that they have, because there's a smaller pool of applicants and qualified applicants. But we're not seeing that at all. Despite that, in the first quarter of 2018, corporate profits were historic in the past 7 years at 16.3%. But corporations are not investing that money into their businesses.
Right.
They're investing it, and they're giving it basically back to their stockholders and taking
shareholders
it as profit. So we're not seeing, any real increases in benefits for working people who make the value and the benefits of these corporations. Just another thing, just for context, because I have to call them out. In the first quarter of 2018, the baking industry made $56 billion, which is a record year of profits, despite their constant claims that they're an over-regulated market.
Right.
So anyway, so about this unemployment factor, there's a couple things that the left, people who have goodwill who are trying to understand this phenomenon constantly cite, and I just want to correct the record a little bit. The first thing that a lot of people are talking about is automation.
Right.
And there's all this fear that robots are coming in and they're taking our jobs, or jobs are being automated away.
Well, I had heard that there was a model that would not bitch about his last name.
That'd be a good one. I can't do a good robot voice, so he might have me beat there too.
Yeah.
But
Alexander Coburn was my hero. Pronounce my name however you like. Sorry. Yes. No. Please go ahead. There's the idea. Yes, robots are taking our jobs. You say not true.
Well, I say not true because if that were the case, then we would see much larger we'd see a spike in productivity. along with a larger unemployment rate. And we would also see a large increase in GDP growth, which is not the case. In fact, the past 8 years have been abysmal in productivity growth. I mean, we're hanging around like less than 1% in productivity growth.
And that's because literally like human productivity has been pushed to the point of like just along all collars of the work chain, from just raw, brutal overwork of people doing physical or service sector jobs. They're just totally overworked to literally the bone. And then even people who are much more, privileged workers are actually in their own way still completely overextend. Like if you talk to people who work in, tech or law, like, types of hours and time commitments that just, if they were pushed more, it would literally be physically impossible for them to complete tasks. So what you're saying though, but the number of productivity rises would be reflected differently if robots were really swooping in, because then you could, extract more productivity from automated labor. So you would see higher jumps.
But, about your point, what we are seeing is we're seeing a huge rise in people who are having to work 2 to 3 jobs to get by.
Right.
So, wages are stagnant, and, people basically are unable to get by on the wages that they have from having full-time jobs. So, I mean, but basically the biggest factor with that, though, Michael, just to, is 100% correct. We really couldn't be squeezing the market much more than we are unless we were making investments to make work better for people, which obviously they're not very interested in
God
doing.
forbid,
But
fuck that.
It's the old technologies that are really getting people in trouble. It's communication and distribution chains. What does that mean? I mean the ability of U.S. companies to be able to go to the developing world and have most of our consumer goods be produced in other countries. So, I hate to say it, but it's really the old model of capitalism that still is the model of capitalism that we need to be talking about and working to change and to make different.
The supply chain is globally distributed. The IP is here.
Yes.
And the corporations are in Ireland.
Yes.
So you pay less taxes.
Well, of course, corporations pay and nothing more than paying any taxes.
Right.
So, I mean, basically what I'm trying to say is like the logic of capitalism is the same way that it's been for 150 years, which is that certain corporations are able to grow monopoly power through using technologies and distribution and transportation to have a stronger hold over the working class. The working class is only able to rise up when they're organized and they have solidarity between workers. And we've seen across the board in the Western countries, even in the UK right now, we're seeing a similar kind of situation with wages stagnating. So it's not just an American problem. And this is what happens when you lose the ability of the working class to be able to organize together to demand higher wages. So basically, just to sum it up in one line, it's not robots, stupid. It's class power.
I love it. Perfect. Nailed it again. That's the third Griscom Economic Minute. Third of many, many to come. That's excellent. Perfect. All right. We got a brief, let's do a little gulag segment, and then we're going to get to new buddy, first-time guest, Cody Johnston. Do we have our music? Now, I have to be honest with you. I'm kind of like, for this segment, obviously, I'm all for like the gulag irony and not so irony at times. Although I think, some of these like Stalin memes and stuff are really getting tired. What's interesting about today's gulag entrant is that, like, actually, yes, 100%, right? So there's a lot of people who we pick who, yes, if I was being honest, I probably would imprison them in some sort of way. I would certainly hector them. I might take away their writing and social media privileges. But this is a person who, like, yes, should be transported into time if he were alive and dumped into a Soviet gulag. And I'm talking about a guy named Luis Posada Carriles. And he was a Cuban terrorist who was recruited by the CIA in the early 1960s. He was involved with everything from the Bay of Pigs to Iran Contra. He worked with drug cartels. He worked with death squads and military juntas across the United States, across the Americas, I should say. And he's actually best known for being the mastermind behind the 1976 bombing of Cubana Flight 455 that killed 73 people. I'm quoting now from the Jackman. An attack against the socialist state in Cuba. Fidel Castro called him the cruelest terrorist in the Western Hemisphere. But Posada's CIA-financed career spanned several decades in multiple countries, including the lesser-known stint in El Salvador that placed him at the heart of one of the greatest scandals in U.S. history, Iran-Contra. Posada was dogged throughout his entire career with allegations of being connected with drug cartels. He was also, I believe, connected with the assassination of Ambassador Leterrier in Washington, D.C., and did extensive work in Iran-Contra. In the early 1990s, he was still on CIA payroll, I believe, up until the early 1990s. In Panama, in the early aughts, he was arrested with 200 pounds of dynamite and C4. That was in 2000. And I'll quote again, CIA records are rife with concerns about Posada's ties to organized crime and drug trafficking. Nevertheless, the agency formally retained him for over a decade, even as late as 1993, after the notorious airline bombing that the CIA contacted Posada in Honduras to warn him of a plot against his life. One more from the Jacobin. As Peter Kornblue of the National Security Archives Cuba Project told the New York Times, Posada was a Frankenstein created and unleashed by the CIA itself. Posada was hardly a renegade, and his bloody crusade was no aberration. It was merely the unsavory underbelly of official U.S. policy in the region. Death of a Cold War supervillain by Hillary Goodfriend in the Jacobin, and that is why we sentence for real. I hope if there is some type of continuity of consciousness, he's getting reincarnated into a gulag. We sentence Luis Posada Carriles to the motherfucking gulag. The Bin Laden of the CIA, or I guess the second Bin Laden of the CIA or something. Or Bin Laden was the Carriles of Afghanistan. I don't know, whatever. Fuck it. You get my point. Guys, we're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Cody Johnston. Back, Michael Brooks on the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Cody Johnston. He's the host of Some More News. Cody, thanks a million for being here. How you doing?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
This is the usual in-studio guest slot, but you're joining us from L.A. So when you come out, when you like, get to New York and grind me up your style a little bit, you'll come in studio.
That sounds fantastic. That's the first thing I will do when I land.
Literally the first thing. Don't even stop to like shower or anything like that. You just get off the
and
plane.
then I'll come right back here.
That's right. I like that. I want more commitment like that from guests, actually. You get out, you get on your app, and then you forever negotiate with whatever service you're using, because there's like some special stupid lane at JFK to pick you up, and then they can't find where you are and you can't find where they are, and they're like, my friend, it is you say Delta, and you're like, yes. And then they cancel, and then you cancel, and then you end up in a cab, and then you come here. And then you do the show.
And I'll do
they have a
the interview,
beer.
I guess, in the cab, because I'll probably be late because of all those things that just happened.
Yes. And then you get in, you sit down, you do the show, and then you get some Discord questions, you have a couple of beers, and then you get out, get back to
Yeah, get back to beautiful LA.
Yeah.
Can't wait.
Yeah, right. Then you're back, and then you arrive in LA, and then people, when people don't know, if you haven't traveled to LA, when you get to LAX, they actually spray aromatherapy on you when you get into the airport.
Get nice and relaxed.
Yep.
Talk about your worthwhile trip that you just did.
Yeah. You go like, I had like a really expansive trip to New York. Like I felt like I
could have done it by phone, but it was great.
Cody, let's talk about Elon Musk.
Good. I love that guy.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, this is going to be a much bigger problem than I had anticipated. Let me start with just like what got you? I'll tell you after you tell me, but like, what got him on your radar? Like in terms of some, obviously, most people know who he is, but just as somebody that actually needed to be talked about and thought about a little bit more critically.
I think it just sort of an accumulation of things over time. Because I like, when I was younger, when he first started doing his stuff, I just liked the idea of what he was doing, because who doesn't want electric cars? And I was very into just his general idea of, well, yeah, we're not doing enough for green energy, so I'm going to do it. But then I think the union stuff really got me. Just sort of finding out more what his worldview was and how he was approaching these things. I don't think he necessarily has like the best intentions all the time. He says a lot of stuff where he's like, we don't want unions because it's not in line with our quest for clean, efficient energy. It's like, well, then why are you making like flamethrowers in a candy store? So he just seems sort of generally dishonest. And then you look more and more into him, and you see that he's not any different from any like billionaire, other than this sort of veneer of like, I'm helping, without doing a lot of the work that I think that really requires of people.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I parallel you a lot. I mean, I just structurally, my politics, and I think any just kind of basic rational ability to kind of look at the world a little bit, that level of wealth concentration, even if it was like Mother Teresa or whoever, maybe not Mother Teresa. I guess I read the Christopher Hitchens book. I'm trying to think of somebody more innocuous that everybody could agree is a good person. But even if it is Steph Curry, nobody like $1 billion is a structurally just that shouldn't exist as a category. And it doesn't matter if it's the most ethical people in the world. If you have a society where that level of wealth concentration exists, you have a non-functioning democracy. You don't have the type of broad flow of resources that you need for, just sort of broad basic standards and democratic accountability for everyone. So that's number one. And then, number two, I noticed that here's a guy who, it seems to me, in contrast to somebody, frankly, like George Soros, who, of course, I have the same structural critique of, and I'm sure I have different politics than he does, but he actually did, he has like a washing mechanism with some of his money, right? Like he's dumped his money into some very significant projects which were not clearly just extensions of his own personal self-interest, right? So even if we're going to take it in that like very, very narrow way. But here's a guy who was able, it seems to me, with like very little effort, brand himself as something that he just literally wasn't. He's a glorified government contractor as this like benign space age adventurer. And that's when I took notice. And then I got a whiff of the cult and the fans. And then I really became terrified.
Yeah, it's not healthy.
Right.
And like, I mean, I think also like people sort of don't even realize how much money that truly is. It's very easy to be like, to think of billionaires as very similar to millionaires, which, you know, we can talk about that too, but like a billionaire is virtually unfathomable. Like that amount of money is grotesque. And I don't know, I think even like, you know, there's this the cult of sort of these people who kind of more associate themselves with Rick on Rick and Morty, or they see Elon Musk and they think of like Tony Stark or something. That person doesn't exist. And even then, like literally in the first Iron Man, Tony Stark changed his mind after he realized his weapons could be used against Americans. Like there was no moment of like, oh my God, I'm making weapons of war and that's bad. It's that, oh, some people like use the weapons against me and my kind.
You can't control this massive flow of like light and precision weaponry that I'm just like unleashing across Central Asia, and it might hit my tank convoy. Yeah.
And he, there's when he's announced his, obviously all of his projects are very personal to him. It's all to benefit him. I think one of the other things that really made me pause was when he started talking about the Hyperloop and all these transportation plans, and it all centered around individuals with their cars to stay away from people.
Right.
Which just sort of tells me that he really doesn't get it and doesn't get what we as a society really need in his realm of what he's doing. But when he announced his Pravda, his journalist attacking site because he didn't like people's articles about him,
right?
Someone had mentioned like I toured Tesla, and then they made us sign all these NDAs and these forms, which is not standard for journalists. I've been a journalist for 20 years or whatever. His response was like, wow, you're ignorant. I don't remember you, but disclosing classified U.S. missile technology to hostile nations would violate law. And he goes on, and it's just like, all right, Elon, thanks for the missile technology. Like, I don't know what he's trying
Wait,
to
I thought we
exactly.
were creating like a green solar planet. I didn't know that. Wait, what? I'm confused.
Right,
I
like
thought we were creating this
missile secrets now.
Beautiful future. I had no idea. Okay. What is Elon Musk's background? Because he's also very into deploying the like, I came here with just the shoes of my feet, a backpack, and a handful of rare earth minerals.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, his parents are rich. He went to all these private schools. He
grew up in South Africa, right?
Literally, yeah. Literally, his dad owned an emerald mine, and there's stories of him just like walking around with actual emeralds in his pocket. At one point, he stole some from his dad and sold them. And there's like a story about how like his
how
dad,
do we
like,
know
was
that
bragging
story?
about
Has
how
he
our
said
safe
that?
Couldn't even close. Huh?
Has he said that himself? Like, how do we know that story?
That is a story. I'm going to try to pull it up. That's a story he's told of like it's like him being cheeky sort of thing.
Oh, he's being cheeky, yeah.
Yeah, like or like all of his sort of retorts on Twitter are this air of like not a comic book villain, but kind of.
Right.
Where he sort of distances himself from the truth of what really happened in order to make the image of him seem fun. Even his his flamethrowers that he's selling to
What is
people.
the flamethrower? What is this thing? What is this flamethrower thing? I've been hearing about it.
Like,
What's
not
that?
really flamethrowers,
Yeah.
but they like do shoot fire, and like legally you can't import those. So he changed the name to Not a Flamethrower. It's all just sort of these like side projects to make money for his boring company.
Wait a second. This is Mike Cernovich playing with a Not a Flamethrower. Are you serious? Are you
Like,
connecting?
that's real thing. I don't know if you guys saw
Oh
it. You
my
come over here
God.
for a sec.
What
Just
the
hold it in
hell?
selfie mode so I can kind of see. So just hold it like that. So let me go back just a little bit. So,
Are you doing it again?
No, I'm just gonna show people. Well, yeah, can I do it again from here? You're gonna be okay.
Well, shit. Okay. Sorry.
So I'm gonna do.
Is that his wife? Mike, you keep doing you, bro.
Exactly. I didn't even see that. He blocked me a long time ago.
That's great. So he grew up, and by the way, this is another thing. I mentioned this once, and a lot of like, this type of like dweeb that gets obsessed about Elon Musk said that I was being totally, of course, super racist and unfair. I didn't say anything in the sense that like I really don't know, but I'm pretty grounded in South Africa. It's an area of interest for me. I cover quite a bit. If his parents or his dad was involved in major leadership in an emerald mine, presumably at some points before the collapse of apartheid. Now, I don't know. Maybe his dad was like using his largesse to like secretly fund the ANC or something. But I'm just saying, like, can we also add to the the tally here that it's like this weird sort of rich boy from South Africa who's probably, his parents were probably not on the cutting edge of that issue?
Yeah.
I mean, that
and yeah, I don't
seems
think
that's
anyone's really delved into that, but that's a valid question. If, like, given the context and how he acts anyway.
Right. I mean, I would be fascinated. Maybe his parents were super cool. Maybe there's lessons he didn't learn from them or something. Or maybe he's secretly, but it's just very fascinating to me, especially because he is South African, that he doesn't even like trot out like Nelson Mandela chestnuts.
Be a big oversight from the PR guys.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Right. You wonder, what's there and what he's carried with him aside from, emeralds and whatnot.
Yeah, that is exactly how I'd put it, Cody. That's exactly the type of thing that I wonder. So you found this guy. He's tweeting weird stuff. Nobody should be a billionaire. What is he actually doing? Like, what are his actual businesses and what has he actually accomplished? I hear a lot of talk. Like, every time I get hit with one of his followers, it's like I'm talking to a vision board and not a real person. It's like, okay, I guess that might be cool if that ever happened, but what actually is?
Right. That's that's it, right? Like, what is it? Because I mean, tangibly, he sold a bunch of electric cars to wealthy people.
Right.
He has developed, the solar panel technology he's developed is very impressive and very cool. It would be neat if he sort of installed them places that desperately need and could use them. But like, that's not available to the public yet. So it's all these sort of ideas and projects that you think eventually will be available to everybody. It's this sort of, I think it's the mindset of, well, you sell this to rich people and then that's how we make money. And then we can invest more and do more research and slowly bring the price down. But that hasn't happened yet. I don't think the production for the Model 3, it has been stalled periodically, and those are still like 35, 40 grand. So I think like really one of the few things I think I can really commend him on is what he's done in Puerto Rico. I wish he did more, honestly, but he has like installed his batteries there and tried to help the infrastructure.
Has he done that though, like without side agreements that like, privatize Puerto Rico's, energy grid into perpetuity? I mean, every time I don't know. It's just every time I see something like that, I get really wary of the strings that come with those things usually. Do you know about that?
Yeah, I had the same reaction. It seems legit from what I can tell.
Yeah.
And like even when the grid goes out, he sends text down there to take care of it. So it doesn't seem like this is a venture of like his to actually turn a profit, which I don't think Tesla has done yet either.
But he's gotten a lot of government contracts, right? I mean, that's the other kind of irony. And I have no problem. I think government should be funding and owning a large part of the economy, frankly. But just the brand of that entrepreneur myth with the fact that that's the business model. Get government contracts.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't. The last number I could find was I think from 2015, and it was like $4.9 billion in government subsidies. And then when someone brings that up, obviously he's going to be like, "Well, no, that's not true," and he'll sort of talk around it because he wants to have that sort of self-made man version of himself out there. I came up with online yellow pages, and then I came up with credit card banking, but like online.
I don't know if people think that like maybe we're just being shitty. But it's like every time you get hit with like PayPal, it's like, I think like every single person who has any kind of like basic cognitive function, I think like, especially like if you were like a teenager or something like in the aughts or late 90s, like you had like, well, they need to do that, but for the internet, right? And you were actually right. Like probably the internet did need whatever, like, I don't know, like, yeah, like eventually you'd be able to buy.
For sure.
Right. So what I'm saying is like, that's what those ideas are. Now, of course, the difference is, ability to access capital and all of that stuff. Like that's the difference between like a fantasy and an actual business. But the idea that like you went like to the mount, like to Olympos and like from the sky at this like, oh my God, like on this massive new commerce platform, you're going to need to be able to process credit cards. Who the fuck would have thought of that?
It's all these guys. I know. I mean, it's
okay.
Like, and I don't want to like, you don't want to diminish what they've done. And like, obviously it's fun. It's very fun.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
But like, when people, anytime anyone talks about like Mark Zuckerberg, literally his idea was like how to stalk women at his school, but like do it online.
Literally.
Like, that is what his idea was.
Like rate and monitor chicks on the emerging internet.
A girl hurt your feelings, and so you made a website to follow her around.
And then several years later,
really helped us get to where we are now.
And then several years later, you're just like, yep, Senator. No, I am gonna read all of your instant messages, and you can blow me. Anyways, I have a meeting with.
I guess I can't be the president anymore.
Oh, he can't be the president for other reasons. That testimony substantively was recoverable, but not presentationally. So
no, he's been trying. For the past like couple of years, he's been like hiring all these people to like really ramp up, and I think that everything of the past 5 months has just confirmed to him like, oh no, I'm not even going to be able to try to be the president anymore.
Joel Bennison, he was Hillary's, I think, chief strategist and a pollster for Obama, was plucked up by Zuckerberg, which is, it's actually so funny to me because it's like, and Joel Bennison, like definitely when he was in his lane, did some effective work for Obama, but like, it's funny because even that hiring decision belies like the mythology of Silicon Valley being like rule breakers. It's like, oh, well, I'm interested in politics. Let me hire a guy who just helped crash Clinton's campaign and who has like, the most conventional baby boomer political CV imagine, like, Clinton, Gore. The only interesting thing he did was like go for Obama at a certain point in terms of his political career. That guy's overall professional career is very interesting. I listened to an interview with him once, but like, it's just kind of funny. Like if you were a real, like, quote unquote rule breaker, maybe you'd hire a political advisor that wasn't like, involved in every major center-right Democratic campaign.
Oh yeah, it's the safest thing he could have done. He also, who was it? There's an old Bush campaign aide he hired too. He just sort of went on I can't think of the name, but like he just basically went to like, what are the last 4 major political campaigns? Hire me all of them.
I want to hire.
Like, all right, man. Yeah. I guess that'll work. That's good. I believe that you have ideas that are specific.
What if everybody's information was fed into a billboard, and then citizens could rate each other in a public way?
Can it scan my eyeball if I look at it?
Yeah. Well, I think that's.
Then I'm down. All right, let's do it. Let's do it, Zach.
Then I'm down. Talk a little bit more about the labor stuff. We've been alluding to it. I've mentioned it before, but let's get really specific. There should be no doubt whatsoever, even if you can't get any of the other stuff, that Elon Musk is he is anti-labor.
Yeah, it's very clear, and every time an article comes out about it, he goes on his rant, leading up to eventually starting a website to downvote the articles that he doesn't like about himself. But
yes, it's the motivation behind like public extortion of journalists on Twitter. Yes.
Yeah, A plus, man.
Yeah.
Give that guy $1 billion.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's been for years, you know, and I think part of I don't agree with this, but I know that part of this comes from his idea of how the world is now and what needs to be done to sort of accelerate our progress to where we need to be with energy and all these sort of projects he has. I think it's sort of in line with Peter Thiel's ideology a little bit.
Definitely.
Probably minus the feudalism, but so Tesla is not unionized. I think it's the only car manufacturer that isn't in the United States. And the workers have been trying to unionize. The hearing was today, I think yesterday actually, about this, because a bunch of workers were fired, and they're
fired for trying to unionize.
Right. Tesla says that's not why they were fired, but almost all the workers that were fired had been passing out pamphlets about unions. There was someone gave testimony today that like they were wearing a union shirt or like a pro-union shirt, and then a bunch of security guards kept harassing him and wanted him to like remove his shirt or just leave, even though he'd like worked there for 5 years. So there's just this sort of general idea about it. Whenever it's brought up, Elon will say that they can unionize whenever they want. Nothing's stopping them. You know, I personally wouldn't, because then they wouldn't get their stock options, which isn't like a union thing. Like no union is saying you can't offer stock options. That's just a literal threat that Elon tweeted.
Yep.
That if you unionize, this is what you're going to lose. It's very bizarre, actually, because there's in one of his recent earnings calls, he was yelling at investors who were worried, and basically said that if you're worried about like volatility, don't invest. You know, if you're worried about your shares or anything, don't do it, because this is a volatile company. So like you're threatening to take away something that you don't even think is that valuable.
Right. Right.
So this weird, like talking around this idea that like unionizing is bad, and if you do, you'll lose this thing. But when I'm talking to actual investors, I'm telling them that thing doesn't matter.
Right. Right. Do you think that, I mean, I also want to touch briefly. I mean, I don't reduce politics to these terms at all. And but I just on a very basic level, especially for the type of person who will throw you like these Musk talking points, he contributes a good amount of money to Republicans, right? And even if we set aside a much more filled out debate on, frankly, how much this kind of myth of progress can get us anywhere, this is actually, when we look at, Elon Musk, this is why all of a sudden it's important to like deal with, Steve Pinker's new book and these kind of like techno-utopian fantasies, which seem to always just increase inequality and deregulation and do not have, the answer to things like the climate crisis, and the Democratic Party's failings, right? Like, which are numerous. But even on an incredibly narrow level, like even if we were just going to be like, none of the big stuff is in play, but, God damn it, I'm a Democrat and I believe in science and blah, 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 blah. And Elon Musk is great and you guys are just slamming him for no reason and blah, blah. Doesn't Elon Musk, in terms of campaign contributions, has significantly supported the Republican Party in a way that if we were to translate to policy, certainly would more than make up for a handful of Teslas deployed on the highways of Santa Monica.
Right. Like, yeah, I don't know if he even views it as that, because I think that, if he's contributing to people he thinks will allow him to do more, and give him more freedom. But does that really, if you consider every single thing that like a Republican will support, does that make it worth it? Is that really going to cancel out, like you said, like a couple of Teslas on the highway? Maybe a few houses in the suburbs have a giant Tesla battery in their garage. That's great. But like, what else are you contributing to? And you've got billions and billions of dollars, which I just can't get past.
I know. It's unbelievable. What also gets me, and I want your thought, I'm asking everybody about this. I think that look, maybe like the rando people on Twitter who will like obsess it, like if you send something out about him, about his labor practices, and they go, you don't understand, you're trying to stop progress, and Elon Musk is the greatest man ever, or, whatever. Like, I don't know, maybe those people are actually secretly captains of industry. Maybe every single comment you see like that is like secretly a Peter Thiel or Elon Musk sock puppet or something. But
right.
If that isn't true, and there are normal people who are not wealthy, they are not part of this game, and they will not, almost certainly will not be. What is the psychology that could possess somebody to worship people like this? It's just so bizarre to me. What do you think that's about?
It is very bizarre. I mean, there's a lot going on there. I do think there's an element of that type of person who, and again, I'm going to cite Rick and Morty, and I don't like, whatever you think about that show, it's fine, it's funny. But I think that there's sort
Matt
of
and David hate it. They're trying to get into a fight with you right now, but they're hanging off Mike.
Don't fight me. It's fine.
Don't fight.
But
I like it. You do need to come in studio. You're definitely bringing some California energy to the show.
I think it's got some funny jokes in it.
No, it is.
But
it does
I do
have
think
some
that
funny.
people
It definitely has funny
misinterpret
jokes
it
in
a lot.
Yeah.
Because it's a little more, I'm not going to say nuanced, but like I think that people watch that show and they're like, I'm the smartest guy in the world too, and I can be a piece of shit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is also I think that we've sort of been touching on it. Like there's just a general sense that everyone is failing us, and all these institutions are not doing the things that need to be done.
Right.
So even if you have a person who's not necessarily doing all of the things that he should, he's still presenting himself as being one of the few who can actually help. So I think there is a sort of like savior complex that people have. But at the same time, we're all lied to about like, if you have money, you earned it. And if you don't, you didn't work hard enough. And I think that there's a bunch of people who sort of like look at Elon Musk and look at billionaires or millionaires like that and think, well, I'm that too. I'm just not rich yet.
Right.
Like we're all rich, but like I just haven't achieved it. There's a very prescient Futurama moment where like Richard Nixon is running for president again, and his idea is to ground up the poor and use their teeth as gravel for the rich. and Fry is cheering them on. And Leela's like, well, what are you cheering for, Fry? You're not rich. And he's like, well, yeah, but someday I might be. And then people like me better watch their step. And it's like that sort of contempt for where you are and belief that you're this other thing. So you support the idea and the institutions that brought those people to the top.
I think that's exactly it. Cody Johnston, he's the host of Some More News. I'm a regular viewer. And Cody, this is actually, we've been cooking up a lot of stuff, man. This is going to be the first of more collaborations between us.
This was great. Hope to be back.
Definitely, man. Looking forward to it. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, take it easy, man. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we, can we get out? I apologize, Matt. I'm going to see if I can find this, but it's Teacher Lauren's mom's GoFundMe. I think it's GoFundMe. We have put it up before, and we've put it up. What? Yep, Miriam. That's right. So basically, we've already done an incredible job, and I'm gonna contribute again myself tomorrow morning. But Lauren, who's a really important part of our community, and again, if you were hanging out on Discord, you've certainly been able to have the pleasure of interacting with her. Her mother, Miriam, was diagnosed earlier this year with Graves' disease and thyroid eye disease. And she's been going through a process, and she just recently got denied, I believe it was Social Security benefits while she goes through this. She cannot work right now while she goes through these operations. They're at 6,403, which is an incredible community, and the goal is to get to 8,500. To basically just make sure that, meals and roof and everything is taken care of while the operations in this process is completed. So I'd really like people to join me in supporting it if you can. It's the URL is blocked by a pillar, but could you mind reading the URL out, Matt?
Yeah, let me pull it over to my thing here. Go back to Michael.
Yeah. Could just
it's gofundme.com/please-support-Miriam.
I'd really like, if you can, I'd really like everybody to do that. It's definitely, it's a great way to concretely help somebody in our community. And obviously the bigger lesson is that it's a total and absolute moral obscenity that anybody should be put in a position like this. Healthcare should be absolutely free, universal, completely covered. This should never be something that anybody goes through, and it's again, a product of just sort of utter moral failings and systemic corruptions of our political, economic, and healthcare systems. This could be the case. So we're going to fight that. We're going to win. We're going to create a healthcare system that works for everyone. And in the meanwhile, we're going to show up for our friends in our community. So definitely help Miriam. And please do, if you haven't yet, become a patron today. When we hit 2,000 patrons, even more things, and already a lot already. We're really firing on all cylinders here. The post game is going to be the crew. We have Mike in studio. He's a patron. He's great. Enjoying yourself, Mike? Yeah. Sweet. Mike, one of our great callers, also a Discord participator, and a meetup meter when I do occasional meetups. Another one coming soon. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, intern James. Thank you, DJ Danarchy. Thank you, Chris Lapaco. See you in the postgame.